Ethan Keller sat in a glass-walled conference room, absent-mindedly tapping his fingers against the cool surface of the table. The office at Inceptix Labs had a sterile quality, high-tech, minimalistic, the kind of space where the future was being built one startup at a time. The hum of computers, the whir of the air conditioning, and the faint murmur of colleagues in adjacent rooms were the only sounds that broke the silence. Tessa, his team lead, was talking animatedly at the front of the room. Her voice had a pitch to it that reminded Ethan of a hyperactive lab technician explaining the latest innovation. But he wasn't really listening. His mind was somewhere else, mostly preoccupied with the text messages he hadn't answered and the fact that his coffee was lukewarm. The only thing that kept him rooted to the meeting was the vague sense of novelty that lingered in the air. "All right, everyone, here's the big reveal," Tessa said, a grin creeping across her face as she clicked through a PowerPoint slide. The words Dream Integration System, DS, flashed on the screen in bold, futuristic font. She continued, eyes glinting, "Inceptix Labs is proud to introduce the world's first system that allows us to upload, experience, and manipulate human dreams. This is more than just VR, it's neuroscientific." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his interest piqued only slightly by her enthusiasm. The idea of manipulating dreams wasn't entirely new. It was a concept that had been kicked around in neuroscience circles for years. But Tessa was right about one thing: it was a huge leap. They weren't talking about virtual realities anymore, they were talking about direct access to the subconscious mind. A place where logic, structure, and even physical laws didn't apply. But Ethan was still mostly skeptical. He had seen far too many overhyped presentations at startups that promised to change the world, only to end in bitter disappointment and bankruptcy. This, however, looked different. It looked like a real breakthrough. Tessa's slide shifted, and the screen now displayed an avatar, a blank, featureless figure, standing in a surreal landscape. "This is where the magic happens," she said, gesturing toward the avatar. "With the Dream Integration System, anyone can upload their consciousness into a dream world. They can explore, interact with others, and even change the course of their subconscious reality. No boundaries, no limits." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Wait," he said, raising his hand. "You're saying people can consciously control their dreams? Like lucid dreaming, but with more precision?" Tessa nodded eagerly. "Exactly. But it's even more than that. With the DS, we can enter other people's dreams and even modify them. Imagine walking into someone's subconscious and altering their deepest fears or desires. The possibilities are endless." The room fell silent, and Ethan had to admit, the idea was compelling. He leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "So you're telling me you can actually control another person's dream? Like, if I walked into Jeffrey Bell's dream right now, I could make him see a giant hamster lecturing him on the stock market?" Tessa laughed. "Well, yeah, sort of. It's more sophisticated than that, but yes, if you had access to his dream, you could manipulate it." Ethan couldn't help himself. A small smirk tugged at his lips. "All right, I'll bite. Show me." Tessa's grin widened, and she tapped a few keys on her tablet. A low whirring sound filled the room as the lights dimmed. The next moment, Ethan felt a strange sensation, like his body was floating. His vision blurred, then snapped into focus. He was no longer in the conference room. Instead, he found himself standing in the middle of a pristine, well-lit boardroom. Across from him, seated behind an expansive desk, was Jeffrey Bell, the CEO of Inceptix Labs. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his face locked in a look of intense concentration, his fingers tapping impatiently on the edge of the desk. Ethan blinked. This wasn't reality. It was a dream. More specifically, it was Jeffrey Bell's dream. He looked around, absorbing the surreal details. The office was too perfect, too polished, almost like a set designed for a corporate dystopia. The walls were lined with shelves filled with meticulously organized books, The floor was so clean it reflected the lights overhead, and the air smelled faintly of freshly printed paper. It was all so sterile. Before he could say anything, Jeffrey suddenly spoke, his voice high-pitched and strained. "The numbers are all wrong, Ethan. How are we supposed to market this product if no one believes in its legitimacy?" Ethan blinked again, realizing that his presence had somehow influenced the dream. Jeffrey? I think you've got bigger problems than marketing." Jeffrey turned toward him with a confused look. "Who are you? Why are you in my wait? You don't look like anyone I know." Ethan couldn't help it. A laugh bubbled up inside him. "Well, technically, I'm just a figment of your imagination." Jeffrey's eyes widened as his demeanor became more agitated. "You're an analyst, aren't you? Tell me why this product is failing in China." Ethan realized that he was now interacting with the manifestation of Jeffrey's subconscious, the distorted version of him that existed within the dream. With a sense of growing curiosity, Ethan reached for his tablet, which had somehow appeared in his hands. He began to play around with the interface that he quickly realized that he could manipulate the dream. A few taps, and the boardroom's pristine decor shifted. The bookshelves warped into abstract shapes, the windows turned into enormous fish tanks, and the floor bubbled like molten lava. But that was just the beginning. Ethan had a sudden burst of mischievous creativity. He imagined the desk sprouting legs and transforming into a giant hamster wheel. Instantly, the dream world complied. Jeffrey's desk began to roll around the room, with the CEO looking increasingly bewildered. Ethan felt a rush of power. He was controlling the dream, nudging the boundaries of what was possible. But something else began to happen too. As the hamster wheel continued to spin, Jeffrey's voice faltered. What's going on? Why am I in here?" The situation was spiraling. Ethan had never thought that just a few simple tweaks to a dream could have such a profound effect. The dream itself seemed to be unraveling, and suddenly, the entire scene collapsed. Ethan blinked, finding himself back in the conference room. The lights were back on, the air felt cooler, and Tessa was staring at him, a look of mild amusement on her face. "Well, that was interesting." Ethan couldn't help but laugh. "That was amazing. I could literally feel myself changing the dream in real time." Tessa's eyes shone with excitement. "Exactly. And you just scratched the surface. Imagine what you could do with more control. Imagine how much you could influence." Ethan looked at her, his mind racing. He had entered the world of dreams, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was in control of something bigger than himself. Ethan sat back in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping the tabletop as his mind raced. He had just manipulated a corporate executive's dream like it was some kind of video game. The implications of that, the sheer control it offered, were almost overwhelming. For a brief moment, the reality around him seemed a bit dull in comparison. The sterile room, the glass walls, the hum of the fluorescent lights, none of it felt real anymore. The whole world felt like it was just waiting for him to start tinkering with it. Tessa was still watching him, an amused but expectant look on her face. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice quiet but laced with excitement. Ethan turned to her, feeling a strange thrill that he hadn't experienced in years. I think I've just seen the future," he said slowly, his voice betraying a hint of awe. "But there's something else. Something off." Tessa raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The dream, it wasn't just Jeffrey's subconscious. It was too structured. Like there was some kind of order behind it. And when I changed things, it wasn't just about making him look foolish. I felt like I was shaping something. Something bigger." Tessa's smile didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed. "You're starting to get it, aren't you?" She leaned closer, almost conspiratorially. "That's the key. This is more than a dream. It's a collective space. A world where all of us share the same undercurrents of consciousness. It's a network, Ethan. A whole new dimension to human experience. Ethan frowned, trying to wrap his head around the idea. But you're telling me these people are aware of what's happening? That they can feel me controlling their dreams? Not exactly, Tessa replied, still calm. It's not that simple. They don't know, not in the traditional sense. But their minds are connected in ways we're only beginning to understand. They're part of a larger consciousness, and when you change one part, it ripples out to the rest. Think of it like tuning a radio. You tweak the dial, and suddenly, everything aligns to the frequency you're shaping. The realization hit him then, like a lightning bolt to the chest. So, you're saying, this is not just some isolated dream world. We're tapping into a bigger system. One that affects everything and everyone. Tessa nodded, her eyes gleaming with intensity. Exactly. And that's where it gets really interesting. The more you manipulate these dreams, the more influence you'll have. Not just over individuals, but over entire groups. Over ideas. Over society itself. This isn't just about playing God in someone's dream. This is about shaping the very fabric of human consciousness. Ethan couldn't help but feel a shiver run down his spine. It sounded too good to be true, and yet, standing here in this sleek conference room, surrounded by the technology that made it all possible, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something monumental. So, what's the catch? Why hasn't the world heard about this? Tessa's expression darkened. Because we're not the only ones interested in this power. There are others, other corporations, other governments, that would do anything to control it. They're already aware of the potential. And they're willing to fight dirty to get their hands on it. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. It was one thing to be a part of a groundbreaking project, it was another to realize that people were willing to kill for it. But the allure of power, of influence, kept drawing him in. The chance to rewrite reality, was there any greater temptation? What do we do now? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Tessa leaned back in her chair, her hands steepled in front of her. Now, Ethan, we see just how far we can push the system. You've barely scratched the surface. I want you to test it. Really test it. See what you can do. But be careful. The more you manipulate, the harder it will be to distinguish what's real from what's a construct. For a moment, Ethan sat in silence, letting the weight of her words sink in. There were dangers here, no doubt about it. But the possibilities were limitless. Who could resist? The temptation to change the world, to control the deepest recesses of the human mind, it was intoxicating. Over the next few days, Ethan dove deeper into the system, exploring its boundaries, seeing how far he could push it before things began to unravel. At first, it felt like a game. A series of quick fixes, subtle nudges that shifted people's lives without them even knowing it. He guided a colleague into overcoming a lifelong fear of public speaking. He helped a friend who'd been stuck in an endless cycle of failure to break free and start a new business. The small changes he made in the dream world rippled outward, affecting reality in ways that felt subtle at first, but soon became more apparent. But with each success, Ethan found himself more and more drawn to the system's vast potential. He couldn't help but push the limits further. He influenced a family member to make a major financial decision that would set them up for life, nudged a stranger subconscious to act out a scene that had been a buried memory for years, an old trauma finally confronting them. It was exhilarating. But it was also disorienting. Every time he left a dream, it took longer to feel anchored in the real world. The lines between what was real and what was dreamt began to blur. He'd wake up in his own apartment, his heart racing, not sure if he'd just manipulated someone's mind or if it had all been a product of his own sleep-deprived mind. One evening, after a particularly intense session in the dream integration system, Ethan tried to disconnect, only to find himself falling deeper into the dream. It was like being sucked through a tunnel, the world around him warping and twisting. For a brief moment, he saw figures moving at the edges of his vision, people he didn't recognize, faces half-formed and blurred. As if they were part of a dream that wasn't his own, but part of some vast collective. He tried to shake it off, but the more he pulled, the more the dream seemed to pull back. He was losing control. This wasn't just about shaping the minds of others anymore, it was about being shaped. He wasn't sure where his mind ended and where the collective unconscious began. His heart raced as he found himself in an unfamiliar landscape, an endless, dark void. In the distance, he could make out the vague outlines of figures, all moving in unison. They didn't speak, but their collective presence was overwhelming, like a chorus of thoughts and desires that stretched across time and space. It was as if they were waiting for him to do something, waiting for him to make a decision. For the first time since he'd started this experiment, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years: fear. It wasn't just the fear of losing control, it was the fear that the dream, this shared consciousness, was in control of him. Tessa's voice echoed in his mind. The more you manipulate, the harder it will be to distinguish what's real from what's a construct. Her warning played over and over again in his head, but it was too late. Ethan realized that the line between the dream world and reality had already been crossed. The figures in the void moved closer, and Ethan understood. They weren't just part of the dream. They were him. They were reflections of his mind, his choices, his subconscious desires, and perhaps, even the subconscious desires of everyone else who had ever used the system. The truth hit him like a freight train: this wasn't just a tool for manipulation. The dream integration system wasn't just a virtual reality. It was a mirror, reflecting the deepest parts of the human psyche, and once you stepped inside, there was no getting out. His mind raced, his vision spinning. He was no longer sure if he was in control of the dream, or if the dream was controlling him. The last thing he heard before everything went dark was a whisper: "Do you think you're awake now?" The darkness seemed endless. There was no sound, no sensation, only a deep, suffocating absence that surrounded Ethan on all sides. For a moment, he couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed, if he was still dreaming or if he had finally fallen into some kind of limbo between realities. His heart thudded in his chest, but even that seemed muffled, as though it were happening somewhere far away. Then, a shift. The stillness fractured, like cracks in the surface of glass. Images, faint and half-formed, began to appear around him. Faces, figures, places he couldn't quite recognize, all blending together in a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts. For an instant, they felt like memories, but they didn't belong to him. They belonged to something larger. Something collective. Ethan stumbled forward, reaching out for something, anything, solid. He touched nothing. The images warped, stretching and bending like liquid, flowing in and out of his perception. His mind struggled to grasp hold of what was real. The voices from the void were growing louder, a murmuring chorus of thoughts and emotions that felt like a pressure on his mind. He could feel them pressing against him, surrounding him, trying to break through his consciousness, trying to pull him deeper into the shared space of the collective mind. Ethan. The voice cut through the fog like a blade. Familiar, yet distant. It was Tessa. His chest tightened. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear her voice until that moment. He turned his head, but there was no one in sight. The landscape of shifting images spun around him. "Tessa," he called out, but his voice felt like it came from miles away. There was a sudden, sharp flicker, like a spark in the darkness, and then Tessa appeared in front of him. Her face was distorted, her features shifting and stretching like she was caught between multiple layers of dreams. She looked confused, almost scared, her eyes darting around, unable to focus. "What's happening?" Ethan asked, his voice shaky. Tessa's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She reached for him, but her hand passed through his like a ghost. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, though the words seemed to echo from somewhere beyond her. "What do you mean? What's happening to us?" Ethan's voice cracked with urgency. He took a step forward, but the world around him seemed to pulse with each movement, as if the very fabric of this shared consciousness was unstable. Tessa's face grew even more distorted, her features warping in ways that didn't make sense. "It's too late," she said, her voice fading. "You can't leave." Ethan tried to take another step toward her, but his body felt heavier with each passing moment. The world spun faster, and the pressure in his mind intensified. He couldn't breathe. The shared consciousness was closing in on him, folding over him like a net. The edges of his reality blurred and flickered. "Ethan," a voice said again. This time it was different. This voice wasn't Tessa's. It was deeper, somehow older. It resonated in his chest like a distant thunderclap. He spun around, but no one was there. Who are you?" he shouted, his voice trembling. "You're not supposed to be here," the voice replied, and the words vibrated with an eerie finality. The air seemed to crackle with energy. I don't understand. What is this?" Ethan felt a surge of panic rising in his chest. His hands shook, his heart pounded harder. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But somehow, it was. "You've tapped into something more dangerous than you can comprehend," the voice said, its tone dripping with an unspoken warning. "This is not just a system. It's not just a dream. This is the collective mind, and you are part of it now. You've opened the door. You cannot close it." Ethan's vision went blurry again. His legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed onto his knees, gasping for air that didn't seem to exist. The pressure was unbearable. The whispers, the voices, the emotions, they were all around him, inside him. His mind felt as if it were being pulled apart. The dream had become a trap, and there was no escape. He was a prisoner in his own creation, trapped in a web of collective consciousness. "No," he shouted, his voice hoarse and frantic. "I didn't mean to. This wasn't supposed to happen. I just wanted to understand." The figure, if it could even be called a figure, loomed above him, its presence overwhelming. "Understanding is a dangerous thing. You've opened the door, but now you will never find your way back. You will never know what's real again." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the darkness closed in tighter. He clawed at the air, trying to grasp something, anything that could pull him back to himself, back to the world he knew. But it was all slipping through his fingers, like sand through a sieve. "You're not alone in this," the voice continued. "All who enter are part of this web. All who manipulate it become it. You've merged with the collective now. You will shape it. And it will shape you." In that instant, the images around him shifted again, only this time, they weren't just fragmented memories or distorted faces. They were real. Or at least, they felt real. People he knew. People he had changed. They appeared, walking toward him, their faces expressionless, their eyes wide and empty. A colleague from work. A stranger he'd briefly met. His ex-girlfriend, who had once been a distant memory. They all surrounded him now, frozen in a kind of stasis, their minds caught in the web of his manipulation. Ethan's chest tightened as he realized the truth. He wasn't just a participant in this dream anymore. He had become a part of it, just like them. He had shaped their lives, but now they were shaping him in return. He was trapped in the same cycle, unable to distinguish his own thoughts from theirs. "You are part of it," the voice repeated, and this time, Ethan understood. The collective mind. It wasn't just a network. It was a force, alive, breathing, growing. And now, it was him. Every thought, every decision, every manipulation he had ever made, it was all part of a bigger, shared experience. One he could no longer control. Tessa's voice broke through the chaos. This time, she didn't sound distorted. She didn't sound like she was fading away. She sounded real. "Ethan. You need to wake up. This isn't you. You're losing yourself in this, don't let it consume you." But even her words felt distant now, as if they were echoes coming from somewhere far away. Ethan tried to focus, tried to break free from the grip of the collective mind, but the harder he struggled, the tighter the web became. His mind was no longer his own. It was shared, entangled in a mass of thoughts and desires that stretched beyond comprehension. That he wasn't sure how much time passed. It could have been seconds. It could have been hours. But slowly, gradually, the voices began to fade. The pressure on his mind loosened. The figures around him, his creations, his manipulations, disappeared, leaving behind only the emptiness. Finally, he opened his eyes. That he was lying on the cold, hard floor of the conference room. The sterile lights above flickered. His breath came in ragged gasps. His body felt heavy, disoriented. He slowly sat up, blinking, trying to focus on the world around him. Was it real? A moment passed, and then he realized, he didn't know anymore, that he had stepped too far into the dream. The web had taken hold, and now, he could never escape. The world he had known, the world of reality, had slipped away, replaced by something else. Something bigger, more insidious. The collective mind was no longer an experiment. It was his new reality. His existence. Tessa appeared, standing just a few feet away, watching him with a mix of concern and something darker, something almost predatory. "You've crossed the line, Ethan," she said softly. "And now, you'll never be the same." Ethan stood, feeling a wave of dizziness wash over him. But there was no escape now. There never had been. The collective consciousness had claimed him, and there was no going back. Tessa smiled, but it was cold. "Welcome to the future, Ethan. Welcome to the collective dream." And with that, the world around him faded into the darkness again.